Welcome to the Patrick Coffin Show. We're going to talk about the coming COVID-19 vaccine, vaccines in general. Are they safe? Will this be mandatory? Our guest is Dr. Theresa Deisher, and she'll be here shortly to talk about all of this. We're going to go through a lot in a little. There are many kinds of pathogens in this world that you need protection from, and one of them is pornography. If you have a problem with porn, or if you want to protect you and your family members from the maniacal maniac known as pornography and its pathogenic, destructive qualities, go to covenanteyes.com and check out their software. It's not just blocker, it's accountability software. It tracks word searches. It sends you to every single page that every device has been searched on. My name, Patrick, will get you 30 days test drive. It is a fantastic addition to your life. It's not for people who want to look at less porn. It's for people who want to go to zero. So covenanteyes.com, my name, Patrick, at the coupon checkout gets you 30 days to test drive this bad boy. Glad you're with us. Our guest is someone I've interviewed in years past. Her name is Dr. Theresa Deisher, founder and lead scientist at Sound Choice Pharmaceutical Institute. She has a doctorate from Stanford University in Molecular and Cellular Physiology, has done postdoctoral work in the University of Washington, and has 47 patents and counting. Dr. Deisher, welcome to the show. Appreciate your time.
Good to be here. Nice to see you, Ken.
Let's go with really basic things, because I need things broken down to about maybe the 6th grade level. It's hard to do because as soon as you start talking about vaccines, phrases begin to appear that are, scientific sounding, a little complicated. Let's start with just the concept of a vaccine. When is the first acknowledged vaccine, and what's the concept behind the enterprise?
So I would think that the first acknowledged vaccine would probably be the smallpox vaccine. And the concept behind a vaccine is that if you expose someone to a virus that is less dangerous than the wild type virus, that you will get immunity not only to the less dangerous virus you expose them to, but also to the wild type. So originally, the first vaccine was, cows get cowpox, which is not as deadly as smallpox. And so they would take, the pustulence from the cowpox and inject it into people, and showed that they had immunity then to the smallpox. So that's the concept. And that's when we were using viruses in vaccines. And vaccinology has evolved dramatically since that time.
Here's a real simple question that's almost never asked. What is a virus?
A virus is a string of RNA or DNA. And the RNA or the DNA is code for the protein that the virus would make. And typically it's just a capsid that would surround the virus. So they can't grow on their own. They require living cells. So they're not living until they're inside a living host. They hijack our machinery to use their RNA or their DNA. They hijack the host's machinery to replicate themselves, to make the capsids, right? So they require a living organism to survive.
Okay. And so RNA and DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, are those proteins, RNA and DNA?
No,
although called acids, that's a little misleading.
Right. Yeah. And so the DNA is the genomic code, right? That, really it's the blueprint for everything that's made. But you don't want to work off of your blueprint, right? Because you can make mistakes. So the RNA is a working copy of the DNA. And the RNA is what actually is used to go through making the proteins and other things that are made in our cells.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. So the host, even though he or she does not have the disease, they're vaccinated with it, which is a kind of a microdose of the virus itself or a replicant of it, so that the host's immune system fights it and is therefore strengthened and quote-unquote immune should they encounter the real thing. Is that a layman's summary?
Well, that's the concept
Yeah.
behind it, but unfortunately, that's not the reality. So, if you're exposed to wild type measles, you have lifelong immunity.
Mm-hmm.
In contrast, the virus in the mumps, measles, rubella, MMR vaccine is an attenuated or a weakened version of the virus. And we do this just by growing the viruses in cells and they spontaneously mutate and become weaker.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the immunity is really only 10 years. So it's not the same thing. That was the concept. And now there's a movement not to use a whole virus, but to just make a recombinant protein. So let's say the virus expresses the X protein,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what we generate immunity to. So instead of giving someone the virus, they would just make the X protein. And now there's a move away from the recombinant. I'm not really sure why, because the recombinant vaccines have been very effective and very safe, to just giving people the RNA and then having their bodies make the protein. So instead of giving them the X protein and they would develop immunity to it, they want to do these messenger RNA viruses. So they give themselves the RNA that codes for the X protein.
Mm-hmm.
And then the person makes the X protein and then hopefully develops immunity to it.
Okay. Now, in times past, what is the traditional or the standard clinical trial length of time between the production and the testing on humans? How many months or years normally go by when a new vaccine is developed?
I would say it would not be uncommon for it to be at least 10 years.
10 years. Okay. So when we hear about Operation Warp Speed and we hear Anthony Fauci, including the president, Dr. Redfield from the CDC, talking about producing a COVID-19 vaccine at or by Christmas or in early 2021, is that incoherent? Is that possible? Is it desirable? Is it safe? See what I'm getting at?
Well, it's possible. I don't believe that it's desirable, nor do I believe that it's safe. And certainly the data from the clinical trials, where there's 15% of the healthy, very healthy young volunteers have significant side effects.
I just read a story today about Father John Field, I believe his name is. He passed away. Father Fields was a Pennsylvania priest who participated in the third and final phase of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine trial. So he got the first shot in August, and then another one in good health and good spirits, and then died of a heart attack on November 27th. Now, maybe it's just a crazy coincidence, but are cardio issues associated with clinical trials for this so far, to your knowledge?
Well, the vaccine companies are not releasing the data to the public. And so what I hear about the data from colleagues of mine who are vaccine experts and are involved in teleconferences discussing the results. And I think that the side effects in cherry-picked healthy individuals are very concerning. And when you get out there into the wild where people aren't cherry-picked healthy,
Mm-hmm.
The side effects will just get worse. It's very concerning.
And isn't it unethical to target, say, vulnerable elderly people already as part of the clinical trials? Because if you're giving the test virus or test vaccine to perfect the product on people who are young, people who are not in the morbid zone. I mean, COVID-19 has killed very, very few young people. In a country of 10 million called Sweden, their non-school lockdown resulted in 0 deaths. So is it, in other words, is it being tested on the right demo, and is it ethical to test it on the correct demo? Older people who are already vulnerable in some ways. Because people have to realize that, like infants, the bodies of old people are very delicate. It's a sort of a sensitive biological environment, and if a few things are off, it can be catastrophic. See what I'm getting at? Like just the morality of testing it at all.
Well, it has to be tested on the population that it's intended to be used in, or it wouldn't be ethical then to go and, release it. So, I mean, I think that the elderly should be able to choose. I think all vaccinations should be voluntary and never mandatory. But the one point that everyone is missed, that people need to be made aware of, is viruses there are different sort of types. So we have influenza, which is a global endemic. It's worldwide. It comes every year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when the SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, struck, we really didn't know how it was going to behave. But what it is doing is it's behaving like a typical type of virus, that they come in waves. And there's usually between 3 and 5 total waves. And with each wave, they become more contagious but less dangerous. That's
Okay.
what this virus is doing.
That is key, because
So
people hear
the
more.
number of
Yeah.
infected are just 20-fold higher than the last wave, but the numbers who are dying are lower. Okay.
Yeah.
And so in 1 or 2 more waves, it will be extremely infectious, a common cold.
Yeah.
Now, people can still die from a common cold, but even, this virus to date has less than a 0.03% fatality rate. And most of those people, I believe it's 92% or above, have other health problems.
Right.
So we're making a vaccine at warp speed for a virus that doesn't look like it's going to need a vaccine.
Do you believe that we're essentially looking in the rearview mirror at COVID-19 as far as the scary mortality rates, the actual threat it poses to humanity?
Oh, absolutely. And it was very frightening at first. And that was because China was not forthright with their numbers. And there were reports coming out that 50 million cell phones had been canceled, and then indications that indicated death in China. And that ends up not being accurate.
Yeah, right.
But we didn't have open and honest communication about what this was. And they assumed that this virus was like the SARS virus that came in 2002 and 2003. And so they treated the patients the same way. And it turns out it's a totally different disease. And most of the early deaths were because of how they treated the patients. They put them on ventilators, which actually harms patients with the COVID-19 disease. And so now they know, don't put the patient on a ventilator, have them lying on their stomach, not their back, aspirate the fluid that builds up in their lungs. They weren't doing that. And we have some standard of care. And so while it's very sad and it's very unfortunate that some people still die, most people survive. And, death is a fact of life. Every year, people die. So the death rate is nothing like they had anticipated.
So
before it.
And I think this is the verbal judo that the press did, because when the concept of much higher contagion levels, it's just more contagious, that got translated into more deadly, you're under greater threat. But it's actually good news. A virus that's the more contagious it is, the less lethal it tends to be. So that's good news. We get to herd immunity, and we can move forward with life in a mask-free zone. The Danish study that just came out last week I think proves conclusively that it's not worth it. Masks don't work. There's no
No,
magical thing.
masks do not work. And 87% of the new cases in the US always or almost always wear a mask. So it looks like the masks increase your risk of getting infected about 12-fold.
Yeah.
So
then there's hypoxia and dizziness from like things like long flights. But that would be
bacterial pneumonia and
sure.
Yeah.
In Coffin Nation, I like to extend our members to have the chance to ask questions of our guests, and I have some. But I want to ask you about something I just watched with my own eyes, and it was a close-up video of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, unfolded with the table of contents and the ingredients and so on. And one of them says, I'll just call it CHAD. It's CHAD0X1-S, and then it's bracket recombinant human MRC-5. So if you look up those individual things, and I'm asking people not to believe me, but to do their own research, recombinant DNA is DNA that is sourced from different places, right? It's not necessarily even human, not necessarily limited to a single source, right? Isn't that what's the heart of recombinant DNA?
Right. So recombinant DNA is it's a string of DNA that we want to put into a cell because we want a protein made. And so the recombinant refers to we get the DNA to insert, to recombine with the DNA in the cell.
Mm-hmm.
And then that protein that we want, and it could come from anything, right? It doesn't have to be human. And it doesn't have to be into a human cell. It could be into a carrot cell. Then that cell makes the protein. So if we wanted to make the spike protein that this SARS-CoV-2 virus, that's the virus that causes COVID-19,
mm-hmm.
we would take that DNA and we would get it to insert into the DNA of a cell, recombine. And that's why we use the term recombinant.
Okay, so the human MRC-5, I looked this up as well, that is derived from its Medical Research Council. That contains material from a 14-week-old aborted baby boy's lung tissue, sourced in 1966, and obviously multiple times. I wish I could say that the Pontifical Academy of Life is in the same shape as it was under John Paul II. It seems to have been mostly gutted by Pope Francis. I'm asking as a Catholic, what kind of guidance has the magisterium given for the morality of vaccines that are produced using material from aborted cell lines from fetuses? So
the MRC-5 is a cell line, and it was made from the lungs of an electively aborted baby, and the abortion was back in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
So the teaching of the Catholic Church, the full teaching, is that if there is grave risk to health, if there is no moral alternative, if the user of the vaccine or the parents, most vaccines are for children, make their objections known, and if they actively work to see that alternatives are developed, then it is permissible to use vaccines that are made using cells from aborted babies.
Because the cooperation is so remote and not intended by the user?
Because the cooperation is so remote and not intended by the user, but they do not say that it is a good. They do not say that it is required. They only say that it is permissible, and those conditions have to be met. And unfortunately, most people don't read the full teaching. And so they never consider, well, is there grave health risk? Are there alternatives? Did I object? Am I actively working to make sure that alternatives are produced?
Yeah. And
they just hear it's okay.
Right.
That's not what the church has said.
Yeah, there's lots of confusion swirling around them. Here's an acronym I read on the side of the AstraZeneca box. MHRA. Okay, it says MHRA, urgently seeking AI or artificial intelligence software tool to process the expected high volume of COVID-19 adverse drug reactions. As a layman reading this fine print suggests that the manufacturer of the vaccine knows or anticipates there will be a high volume of adverse drug reactions. There will be events associated with taking it. Now, I don't know if Father Fields died because of his third round of the Moderna version of this. Am I misinterpreting this, or are they looking for a tool to collate all of the volume of adverse reactions, and they're trying to get their arms around it beforehand? But they know it's going to cause damage, injury, maybe even death. Am I overinterpreting that?
The MHRA is the counterpart to the FDA. And so it's the European regulatory agency that is forcing the companies to collect all of these side effects. And yes, they do anticipate significant side effects.
Yeah, it was a UK box that I was looking at, so non-FDA. Before I turn to questions from Coffin Nation members, the 1986 Child Injury Act signed by President Reagan, which indemnified manufacturers from any liabilities in the case of injury or death. That's unimaginable if a president indemnified Ford or Chevrolet from vehicular problems caused by the design of the cars. Is that a fair analogy? And has that Child Injury Act made life very difficult for parents who have no recourse except the fund that was set up, VAERS, I think it is?
Theirs is the Adverse Event Reporting System.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1986, the vaccine manufacturers were essentially granted carte blanche immunity. And the reason that they were granted that is, so first of all, our government sees vaccines as a issue of national security, and they are concerned with biologic warfare. And the DTP, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine that was made in the U.S. was so harmful that companies were losing so much money in lawsuits. And so at that time, there were only 4 companies who were still making vaccines, and they were threatening to stop because they were paying out so much in injuries. And the government did not want vaccines to go away, and they want these companies ready if we need a rapid vaccine in the case of biologic warfare. And that is why carte blanche immunity was granted. But I think in hindsight, it was, it was not obviously the right decision. And families, children have been harmed, grievously harmed. And there's no other case where we would give a perfectly healthy person something that is pretty much mandatory because of our education policies that can damage them, and then have no recourse or consideration for that child's life, for their family. It's really an atrocity, I think, that's been committed on the American families.
And if there's a tort brought by a family that survives either an injury or a death, they would receive funds from taxpayers, essentially.
Well, the funds, parents are very rarely, if ever, compensated. The cases are denied constantly.
I was not aware of that. Here's Gilles Normandot. He asks, how is vaccine efficacy determined, especially with such a short test time frame? Extrapolation of such a small sample size can lead to wrong conclusions. Also, how can we be certain that there will be no long-term side effects? Twofold question there.
So for the COVID-19 vaccines, they're determining efficacy by measuring how many people get the COVID-19 infection. So for example, the first 100 people who get the infection, they unblind the treatment, and in one of the vaccines, 95% of the people who got the infection got a placebo.
Mm-hmm.
And 5% got the vaccine. And that's where they come up with the 95% efficacy rate. But that's actually not a legitimate efficacy determination. And they will have to, I mean, it will be hundreds of thousands of people really out in the wild before we will know. And just as a comparison, the most effective flu vaccine that we have is only 44% effective.
Yeah.
It's unlikely that they're going to do better.
Yeah.
The coronaviruses are not good candidates for a vaccine. They're just not that highly immunogenic. And so it's not just the virus or the recombinant protein or the mRNA. They're using, they're really having to boost the immune response, and that's probably driving the side effects.
Okay. Very good. All right, Jill, thanks for that. JC Biagi, I have 4 little kids, and I'm not an expert on vaccines, but there's so much noise around our young family. What vaccines make most sense for a family like ours, and what advice could Dr. Deisher offer to help young families make important decisions? Does the Sound Choice website, or is there another source where you can learn, look, this company makes vaccines with aborted fetus as part of the cell line, this one doesn't? Is there like sort of a safety, common sense vetting website to your knowledge, or a source?
They can go to our website, www.soundchoice.org, and there is a list, so they can know which vaccines are manufactured using the aborted fetal cell lines, the human fetal cell lines, and alternatives to them. This is my advice that I would give to parents. And people don't understand this, but vaccines require a healthy immune system.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have a healthy immune system, that vaccine is not going to induce the protection that you want. Yeah. So the first thing to do is to make sure that your family has a healthy immune system. And for a healthy immune system, you need vitamins A, C, D, and E. You need all 4.
Mm-hmm.
Eat healthfully, eat fresh foods, and take your vitamins.
Separately, though, right? I keep hearing doctors not recommending multivitamins. It's too diluted. It's a marketing gimmick to save you time. You recommend separate?
I take separate, but for people who only want to take a multivitamin, depending on their age, I tell them to take between 2 and 4 a day. Because they don't give you 100%. And right. And water soluble vitamins, if you get too much, you just pee them out, like vitamin C.
Right.
So A, D, and E are fat soluble, so you don't want to take too much overdose on those.
So if you walk into Costco and there's a bottle of vitamin D, that's what's the dosage on a standard OTC vitamin D? Do you know? 50, 100?
It's usually 500 per tablet. And, you can safely take up to 1,500 vitamin D3. So I actually do 1,500 if it's really, I live in Seattle, it's gray and dull. And if you're having trouble, you just take a little extra vitamin D in the wintertime. But on most days, I just take 1. I take 2 tablets of vitamin C. So that's a little extra. I eat 1 egg for my vitamin A. And then I take 1 vitamin D, D3, and 1 vitamin E tablet.
Zinc?
I recommend that people take zinc. That is antiviral. I also recommend people drink tonic water. It has quinine in it, which is an antiviral, anti-malarial compound. People say if you add gin, it's even better. I just do the tonic water with a lime.
Or just forget the tonic water, just drink the gin? No.
No. I think you need the tonic water. But
I got you.
Yeah. So, eating grapefruit. Grapefruit has a natural quinine type in it as well. The rinds have high levels of that, so you can kind of steep the rinds and protect yourself.
I would think that grapefruit rinds would make great hot tea.
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Matthew Shadrix, please ask Dr. Deisher to point out which vaccines do not come from aborted fetal stem lines. He says, as far as I know, only Pfizer's isn't. And whether the group sizes of these trials match anything close to what has come before.
So the group trials have certainly matched what has come before, but the follow-up has not. And when we look at immunity, we have two branches of our immune system. It's more complicated than that, but we have T cell immunity and we have B cell immunity. B cell immunity is your antibodies. We know in patients who've recovered that the antibodies are only there for a couple months. It's unlikely that a vaccine will have greater longevity.
Mm-hmm.
So theoretically, you would be looking at a booster shot every 6 months. Again, for a virus that's coming in waves, it's becoming more contagious, much less dangerous. In the next wave or the one after that, it will probably just be a common cold.
Yeah. In that scenario, go ahead.
Well, that's a lot of vaccine to be taking for something that will be of no significance anymore.
Yeah, it's almost like the law of diminishing returns. At that point, it's preventing getting to this herd immunity because you're kind of what was all the rage all summer long? Flatten the curve. This sounds like extending the curve.
Yeah, hindsight is important. And what I just wish is that the public health officials would take an honest, objective look at data and change our policy. With the first wave, we didn't know what this was. And so I don't think anyone can really be criticized for making a bad decision. But we know a lot about this disease now, and the hype and the passion over it is just not, it's out of proportion. It's
wildly out of proportion. Yeah.
And we just have another lockdown in Washington state, and the businesses, the impact on children, mental health, suicide, domestic abuse. They need to say, we didn't know. Now we know. There's no justification for what we are doing.
Yeah.
And instead they just do more. Oh, that didn't work. Let's do more. I mean, that's not rational.
Double and triple down on your previous mistakes. If you were the main advisor to President Trump, what's the one piece of advice you'd be most eager to give him?
Tell people to take their vitamins and not buy toilet paper.
Toilet paper also tastes terrible too.
I mean, our government was telling people to buy toilet paper instead of take vitamins is
that's
unconscionable.
Yeah, you can't. Parity becomes impossible. Margot Basso, what does she know about COVID vaccines being developed? Are there any truly safe ones that don't come from aborted fetal stem cells? She says, my parents were both in their 60s, both want to get the COVID vaccine when it comes out, and I want to give them good facts about it. And of course, my lovely liberal governor Pritzker in Illinois is threatening to somehow make it mandatory for everyone in Illinois to get it. He wants 100% compliance. So of the ones that are racing to the finish line, any of them not involve aborted fetal stem cells?
So first of all, there are two racing to the finish line, which are messenger RNA vaccines. I would not take either one of those.
That's from Moderna?
Yeah, the potential dangers and side effects from those vaccines are quite high and quite plausible, never been used before, and I would not take either one of those. So there are recombinant vaccines that are on the way, and there's 51 of them. So I actually kind of pulled out a latest list. I would consider a protein-based vaccine.
This is not 51 different companies though, right?
Well, there are 51 different, vaccines now,
candidates.
not all in the US, but over the world.
Mm-hmm.
But for instance, in the US, there's a vaccine from Novavax, and that is not manufactured in the fetal cell line. They do use a fetal cell line to test the product, right? But so it's not used to make the product, but they do use it in their research. And then from Sanofi and GSK, there's a protein sciences vaccine. And Protein Sciences developed the recombinant flu vaccine, which is the safest and the most effective influenza vaccine. So those are both Operation Warp Speed, and I would consider those vaccines.
If you felt that you had to.
If I felt that I had to.
Would a rational person be on solid ground to just eschew any vaccine that comes out for COVID-19?
Yes.
Yeah. A lot of people are asking the same question in a similar way, and thank you, Margot. And that is this going to be mandatory? Xi Jinping, the Chinese dictator, has already begun QR codes for travelers. Qantas Airlines are now setting up a system where you've got to have proof that you are. I mean, that's the plan. Proof of vaccination before you get on an aircraft. Now, that's I would call that soft mandatory mandatory vaccine application, because you're not technically forced, but if you want to travel anywhere, that's the first wave of enforcement, and it's a pretty strong inducement to take it. What are your thoughts on the mandatoriness?
That's how we make childhood vaccines mandatory. They're required for public school.
Yeah, right.
So it's the same thing. No, I would not envision that it should be mandatory at all. I think that these airlines are overreacting, and they've never before done this for influenza, which comes every year.
Mm-hmm.
I've sat on airplanes with the person beside me coughing and hacking away, and they do absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
I've always worn a mask on airplanes because I would travel quite a bit, and I don't want the person beside me necessarily coughing and hacking on me, and I would direct my airflow to, keep their cough away from me. But
also, yeah,
they can create a mandatory vaccine without having to actually be mandatory by limiting your rights.
Right. Alan Dershowitz, the attorney, Harvard Law professor emeritus, has said on a podcast that the police have the power to take your shirt up and expose your arm and jab you with a vaccine. So I think he's dead wrong about that. But for someone who has such knowledge of the Constitution to say that publicly is frankly bizarre. Have you heard that?
They did that with the smallpox vaccine.
Okay. Then it becomes a question of comparing the lethal nature of smallpox to the relatively benign threat represented by COVID-19. Isn't that where the analogy breaks down?
Well, the analogy does. It breaks down there, but the smallpox vaccine actually, I believe 7% of the people had extreme immediate reactions, including death, which is why people were refusing the vaccine. And there are some cities where, the militia went around force injecting people. I can't imagine that that's in our Constitution. I'm not a constitutionalist, but that would shock me.
Yeah.
That anyone would have the right to invade someone's individual liberties.
Deborah Japong, how do these new vaccines work? Do they change our DNA? And how dangerous is this for potential autoimmune diseases down the road or other complications? Do the vaccines go in there and change your DNA?
Well, that's a good question. And the vaccines that are messenger RNA vaccines, it's a little m and then capital RNA. What they do is they act like a virus, and they hijack the cell's machinery, right, to turn that mRNA into the protein. Now, messenger RNA can also be what's called reverse transcribed. into DNA. And like a virus has special codes that activate the reverse transcriptase so that it actually gets into your DNA, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, an RNA virus uses a reverse transcriptase in our cells to make itself into DNA and permanently insert into the genome. Okay, viruses can do that. There is a possibility that the messenger RNA could be made into DNA and permanently insert. It doesn't have all of the efficient components of a virus, but the spontaneous possibility is there. What is the number? We don't know. Is it 1 in a million? Is it 1 in 100,000? Is it 1 in 1,000? It might not matter. If you're the 1 in 1,000 that happens to, the numbers really become less relevant. So there is this possibility, this spontaneous possibility. Some people would like to say that the number is 10 to the minus 13. Basically, trillions of people would have to be dosed before we would see it. But those same experts said the same thing in a gene therapy trial. They said, oh, the danger is 10 to the minus 13. 4 of 9 boys had DNA insertions and developed leukemia. So 4 of 9 is a lot different than 1 in a trillion.
Yeah, slightly.
So we don't know what the number is, but I can tell you it's not 1 in a trillion. I don't know if it's 1 in a million or 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100,000, but there is a possibility.
Astrid Bennett-Gutierrez, my question for Dr. Deisher is what she thinks about governments making the vaccine mandatory. We talked about that a little bit. Do you think that's coming?
I don't think that the federal government can. I think that states, but through legislation and through limiting access. So if you say, okay, fine, we won't use your public schools, we won't use any of your public systems, and we'll go live out by ourselves, will they drive out there and jab you with a needle? I don't know. I mean, the response to this virus is not rational. It's no longer rational.
It's all of the control is no longer about COVID-19 anymore. Now it's about oligarchic ability to inflame the masses with irrational fear. A populace that's full of fear is very easy to manage. And just Google the name Klaus Schwab. They're not hiding what this is being used for anymore.
No, and if you look at this, so if you are in fear, your cortisol levels go up, and cortisol kills your immune cells. Okay, so fear is bad for a healthy immune system. If you isolate, if you lock down, and you're not exposed to bacteria or pathogens or viruses, your immune system takes a break. And if you wear a mask, you also can hinder your functioning of your immune system. So we have people wearing masks. I mean, I see them out by themselves, no one in sight, walking their dogs.
100%.
They're terrified. They're wearing masks and they're locked down. When they come out, they're not going to have immune systems.
And how about the army of hand sanitizers? I go to Costco. Everyone's got this battalion of water shooters spraying down the carts. George Carlin has a really funny thing back from the 80s or 90s on how he grew up in New York, and they would swim in raw sewage in the river there, and no one got polio because they were. He's joking, but the constant putting yourself into interaction with germs is good for your body because your immune system gets a workout, it gets stronger. So you have people. It's like a perfect storm. Everything's hand sanitizers. Everything is cheerleading for isolation. And add that into fear. There's 3 factors right there which damage your immune system, your response to this thing to the get-go. Go ahead.
to think about mass vaccination of populations whose immune systems are not working well because of how this has been handled, I don't know what will happen. I think that's frightening.
Mm-hmm. As a Catholic, I see priests with masks and the visor, with gloves, giving the body of Christ to someone who's also looks like they're in a full hazmat gear. The Council of Trent defines that the sacraments are necessary for salvation. So how is it that I can go to my local store and I can manhandle rutabagas and carrots and Brussels sprouts and no one says anything? Are my hands washed? Who knows? Who cares? But the sacraments are a threat and you have to shut the churches down. It does not compute.
Well, nothing computes. And if you look at what's being taken away, touching, hugging,
right. Mm-hmm.
handshakes, smiling. Think of the children who've never seen another adult smile. Music, dancing, faith, our sacraments. And our church here in the Archdiocese of Seattle was the only organization not ready to open when the first opening came around. I mean, I'm flabbergasted. Flabbergasted.
Yeah, in some cases, the bishops closed down when the governors were inviting to open up.
Yes.
Yeah.
So everything that makes us human and beautiful is being taken away. But Black Friday was okay. Right. But don't have turkey with your grandmother.
Yeah, I know. It's as if the virus is so smart that Governor Newsom's curfew, it's going to disappear up into the clouds during the curfew, but then it'll come back down in the morning. When you get on an airplane, you have to have the mask on, but you can take it off to eat and drink. Then the vaccine, it can't attack anybody. You walk to the virus, yeah. What did I say, vaccine? Freudian slip.
Yeah.
So you go into a restaurant and you have to have the mask on. You can walk 2 feet and sit down, take it off.
I know.
It's like, why aren't people noticing what's going on here? A couple more questions.
They want to be in fear.
Yeah, it's an odd thing about human nature. We seem fitted to it somehow.
Well, it's dehumanizing if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's dehumanizing atmosphere.
Tiziana Dizon, she asks, are there any vaccines developed from cord blood cells or placenta cells?
Not that are commercially available. And I would have concerns about those cell lines as well because they're primitive cell lines. So there is more than just ethics and morals. There's actually sound science that says that using a primitive cell line to make a drug that we're going to take is dangerous. And that would include placenta, potentially umbilical cord.
So when you say primitive, you mean structurally too oversimplified? You don't mean simply young, right? What do you mean by primitive?
I mean young.
I see.
So and when we say primitive, our DNA is not just ATCG. It's decorated. That's a field called epigenetics. And there are groups on the DNA called methyl groups. And it turns out that if the DNA has lower methyl groups than an adult, that it can readily insert into the DNA. So viruses are undermethylated. That's why they get in our DNA so readily. So any source that's undermethylated would be a concern.
This is kind of a follow-up question to that from Tiziana. You mentioned that the manufacturers are not giving out a lot of data. What about side effects? Are there any side effects recorded and available or announced of any tested COVID-19 vaccines so far?
Well, there are some. So, for instance, the vaccines, they're requiring 2 jabs, like 2 to 4 weeks apart. And so they're reporting fever rates. And typically with a vaccine where you have to get repeat injections, the percent of people who get a fever goes down and the temperature of the fever goes down with the second injection. With these vaccines, the number of people getting fevers and the degree is going up.
Okay.
That's a concern, and of an abnormal, concerning immune revving up. And additionally, I believe it's Pfizer's vaccine. They're telling people to anticipate needing 3 to 5 days off from work after each jab for illness. That's a pretty significant side effect.
Yeah, no kidding. And that's the thing that they're recommending openly. I wonder if they're underestimating it. Should an immune-compromised person take a COVID vaccine?
No.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to rephrase that. Not a whole virus one, because they're immunocompromised. And then they could get the disease. Would taking this recombinant spike protein, right, or the messenger RNA vaccines potentially cause the disease in an immunocompromised person? No, but it's unlikely that they'd be able to mount a good immune response, right?
Sure. Yeah,
but now, after the lockdown and all the fear, 50% of our population is immunocompromised. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be frightening to see what happens as they go vaccinate.
Right. Miriam Williams, does Dr. Deisher recommend getting an MMR booster to possibly help prevent serious complications of COVID infection? Any connection there?
I do not recommend getting an MMR booster because the MMR is manufactured using human fetal cell lines. If you can get the single measles manufactured in an animal line, and those vaccines are available in Japan, then I would recommend it. And there's some suggestion that the measles vaccine can induce immunity against the SARS-CoV-2. There's some evidence that the tuberculosis vaccine can provide immunity against the SARS-CoV-2.
Interesting. Do they have a manufactured in X company on the box of the vaccines that you bring home? Like made in China? I'm going to go for made in Japan myself before made in China at this point.
You would actually have to travel to Japan at this point to get the single measles. We 12 years ago had a huge effort to actually bring those clean, safer vaccines to the U.S., and we were thwarted in those efforts and not successful.
Frances Bertolini asked Dr. Deisher if she trusts an RNA vaccine and what in fact could be the downside of a pervasively used RNA vaccine. Touched on that a bit.
That's a good question, and we've touched base on that. And I would not take an RNA-based vaccine.
Is that the messenger version?
That's the messenger RNA.
Yeah.
And while it's just the messenger RNA, it isn't like a virus that efficiently has all of the machinery available to it to insert into our DNA. There is a chance that it could spontaneously insert. So I would not take an mRNA.
Is anyone talking about when the floodgates open, when this COVID-19 vaccine will be available for people? I hear President Trump talking about deploying the military, which, going to your point earlier about it's traditionally been seen by the government as a threat to national security, bioterrorism, and so on. But it sounds militarized. I mean, we're going to deploy. It sounds like what Dershowitz is arguing for. You need the military instead of people willingly going to do it because they trust it, because they've done the research. Any date? Do you know?
People say January. There's been an emergency use authorization in the EU, I believe, or the UK for one of the vaccines. That's an mRNA vaccine. And that was just recent, maybe a couple days ago.
Sure.
So perhaps January or February. They're not going to have the doses available for the general population at first. And so they're going to reserve them probably for first responders. And unfortunately, those people will be forced to vaccinate. I'm pretty sure.
Those people defined as?
doctors, nurses, anyone working in the hospital systems, ambulance drivers, EMTs, are first responders. They'll probably reserve vaccines for that, for the military, maybe the police, firefighters,
Gotcha.
state patrol.
Okay. I saw a clip from a British member of parliament, Sir something, I forget his first name. His last name is Duane, and he had a good idea. He said, rather than scare people and promote the conspiracy fears about a forced vaccine, have every member of parliament, starting with the prime minister, get the vaccine on camera, broadcast it, and then he said, get all the lovies, by which he meant the celebrities and cultural icons, get them to make up songs, singing its praises. So get everybody on camera who are influencers in the culture and start there. But they won't. I've seen some clips of politicians overseas allegedly getting the vaccine, but curiously, you don't actually see any contact. It just looks a little staged to me. But
I've seen those as well. I think that the politicians, they're aware of the dangers and the risks that the public's not aware of. There are advertisements where they're advertising vaccines in Washington state saying you can get immunity without getting sick, but at the same time, Pfizer's telling their volunteers will plan on 3 to 5 days off of work after each jab. So those advertisements are false and very misleading.
And I hope a full workup by a medical examiner in the case of the late Father John Fields is done to see if any causal connection between his 1, 2, 3 Moderna vaccine jabs. I hope that's well researched. That will be another topic for another show. I want to thank you for your work. One last thought there?
No, I mean, there's a bigger discussion to be had. And I think a workup is really necessary. But patients, people who get the infection, who develop high levels of antibodies within a week, they shouldn't get sick, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they have a really high immune response. They get the sickest.
Yeah.
Which indicates an autoimmune attack from the antibodies that are made to the virus. And that's a danger with any vaccine. I'm very concerned.
Mm-hmm. In our recent summit, Truth Over Fear, which interested parties you can still get a premium pass at restoretheculture.com, one of the opening speakers was State Senator Scott Jensen, who's a medical doctor. And he ran afoul with the medical board in the state of Minnesota over precisely this, being pressured to call the cause of death as COVID-19 in people who didn't have it, or it was ambiguous and he in conscience objected. That's a whole other chapter most people don't think about, what appears in a cause of death statistic, which, the CDC quietly, remember they readjusted their number back in the summer from, I think it was 103 down to 7,000. It's like what you said earlier, a couple of 1 in trillion is not the same as, 4 out of 9.
Right.
Slightly different. All right. Well, boy, as always, the super time fly phenomenon has occurred. I want to thank you for your work, Dr. Theresa Deisher, and I want to send folks to the websites that would connect listeners and viewers to what you do. www.avm Biotech, that's avmbiotech.com, and soundchoice.org. Did I get it right?
You did.
Yes.
Thanks.
Great
Thank
success.
you for having me on. It was
Awesome.
a pleasure.
Yeah, you too. Good to talk to you again. All right, this is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?